The first rule of being a wallflower was to acquire a superb seat. Margaret Carberry, daughter of the Scottish tycoon of the same surname and relation of absolutely no aristocrats, was no longer a novice at attending balls. Her mother accepted every invitation. Margaret strolled toward the quietest section of the ballroom, furthest removed from the musicians and dancers, just as she did at every ball. Juliet and Genevieve would be here, and she wove through the horde of party-goers with expertise. Women wore thin white gowns, embellished with pastel ribbons and trimmed with lace, an obvious effort to counter the summer heat. Men flashed strained smiles, discernibly uncomfortable in their complexly tied cravats, jewel-colored waistcoats, and snug tailcoats, the latter a product of a season of feasting. The second rule of being a wallflower was to not interact with anyone. Margaret didn't need to see the expressions of the guests shift when they worried they might need to converse. Though the upper echelon didn't tend toward timidity, few desired to be seen speaking with her. Matchmaking mamas and proud papas no longer pondered whether they should drag their second and third-born sons to meet her, and Margaret no longer felt awkward attempting to talk with the ton. After all, the results were always the same. The creme de la creme frowned at the first lilts of her Scottish accent, and when they ascertained the identity of her father, they hastily excused themselves. Even those in possession of imposing debts deemed it preferable to endure uneasy encounters with their tailors and slash their servant number than jeopardize their respectability. The ton was suspicious of her presence at the occasional festivity, seeing it as indicative of an unnecessary downgrade of society, reminiscent of ideals that might be shared by the pitchfork-wielding peasants who once roamed the other side of the channel. Her father might be wealthier than many of them put together. She might have attended the same finishing school as other daughters of the ton, but that didn't mean she belonged. Margaret would simply find a good seat, then chat with her dear friends. Even Mama wouldn't expect her to find a husband at the last ball of the season. Margaret smiled, even though, when she'd first attended a ball, her lips had hurt from the effort of feigning delight. Now, she almost enjoyed attending these evening engagements. The throng thickened, and Margaret placed her hand on her turban to hinder any instincts the feathers on it might have to flutter away. The only thing worse than wearing a feathered monstrosity would be to wear a destroyed feathered monstrosity. No matter. This was the last event of the season. It was almost over. Perhaps she hadn't found a husband, but she wouldn't be the first woman not betrothed after one season. Besides, Papa was hardly impoverished. Perhaps Mama would agree she didn't require a second season and that she could simply find a cottage in Dorset and live blissfully ensconced with her favorite science tomes. Violins hummed pleasantly. Margaret's body lightened and she quickened her gait. Suddenly, something wet cascaded down her dress, and a definite alcoholic scent invaded her nostrils. She furrowed her brow, but she hadn't imagined it. Icy liquid cascaded down her back. Fiddlesticks. A champagne flute shattered below her feet on the Duke of Jevington's polished pine floorboards, marring the elaborate chalk design, and Margaret bit back a scream. What had she done? Evidently, Margaret's newfound experience at balls had not prepared her for avoiding toppling glassware. Liquid seeped over Margaret's gown. Double fiddlesticks. She patted her back tentatively and dropped her gaze to the broken shards of glass, imprinted with an elaborate gold design. Well, the design was currently less elaborate. A few matrons shot Margaret horrified glances, widening their mouths and furrowing their brows in uncharacteristic disregard for the potential formation of wrinkles. A footman hastened toward her, clutching a white handkerchief. He dove to the floor, gathering the glass shards. Some debutantes angled their torsos toward the commotion and smirked. Their puffed sleeves remained unmarred by any sudden liquid contact, and their embroidered fabric exuded an alcoholic scent-free perfection. Margaret's stomach twisted. This ball was supposed to be enjoyable, and she'd ruined it. Someone grabbed Margaret's elbow, and when Margaret turned, she saw her mother. I saw what happened, Mama said briskly. How clumsy of you. I marched straight over. I'm sorry, Margaret stammered, taken aback by her mother's abrupt appearance. I don't know how. Mama waved her hand in an uncharacteristic lackadaisical manner. It's of no importance, my dear. Margaret's mouth dropped open. Most things were of absolutely importance to Mamma. Making a good impression on the Duke of Jevington certainly ranked at the top of Mamma's desires. This was his ball, and he was unlikely to be enamored by the woman who transformed his glossy, polished floor into a danger zone. Not that the Duke would be enamored even if Margaret hadn't somehow accidentally toppled a glass of champagne. Even other wallflowers deemed Margaret dull. No Duke desired to have a duchess who stumbled when she spoke, and whose cheeks reddened at short intervals. The fact Margaret was apt to speak about facts with the same enthusiasms as others rhapsodized about lofty acquaintances was little solace. You must get dry. Mamma linked arms with Margaret, as if wary Margaret might decide to scamper toward the other dancers in her dripping attire to attempt a reel. They inched toward the exit as more people swarmed into the ballroom. Some people regarded Margaret curiously, perhaps wondering why Margaret had decided that pleasant music, dancing, and food were experiences to be abandoned rather than savored. Others were occupied with craning their necks towards the wonders of the painted ceiling, complete with cherubs and cerulean skies, even if neither sight was frequent over Grosvenor Square. Finally, Margaret and her mother moved past the sturdy carved wooden doors and onto the glossy black and white marble tiles of the Duke's foyer. Margaret stepped toward the cloakroom. Leaving early was embarrassing, but at least they hadn't spotted the Duke. That had to be a triumph. The moment seemed deficient in glory, but Margaret raised her chin anyway. More alcohol dripped down her back, and she shuddered. Mamma pulled Margaret's sleeve. Let's go upstairs. Upstairs? Margaret's voice trembled. Guests didn't venture upstairs. But, Margaret halted. She felt ridiculous reminding her mother about societal rules. After all, her mother had taught them to her. Mamma giggled, even though Mamma never giggled. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Her mother was acting most oddly. She may have longed for her mother to be less strict and dogmatic, but she certainly hadn't expected Mamma to transform into a woman who went about cavorting about the Duke's townhouse. No need for you to be stodgy, dear, Mamma said. If I say it's appropriate, it is. Mamma had always seemed to be the epitome of appropriateness before. Margaret hesitated, but her mother yanked her toward an imposing staircase. Coldness, not merely attributed to the champagne spillage, slinked along Margaret's spine. We mustn't go there, Mamma said. The Duke's accommodations are there. Nonsense, Mamma whispered. You cannot have champagne on your dress. It's unseemly. Besides, the Duke is in the ballroom. Mamma's eyes sparkled, and her lips remained curved in a manner more commonly found in people attending comic operas. She proceeded purposefully up the marble stairs, sweeping the hem of her dress against the balustrade with such force that some of the bows on the hem of her gown unraveled. Clearly, Mamma's lady's maid had not prepared for Mamma's energy. Margaret shuddered at what Mamma might do upstairs, where she might indulge in any snooping tendencies. Mamma could hardly wander alone in the private corners of the townhouse. Margaret glanced in the butler's direction. Thankfully, he was consumed with guarding the door, not the things that happened inside the townhouse. Margaret sighed and followed her mother, sliding a lace-gloved hand over the banister. Gilt-framed paintings of various lovely landscapes, presumably of the Duke's extensive properties, lined the stairs. Everything was beautiful, even if art enthusiasts were unlikely to clamber up the steps to scrutinize the paintings. Whatever other paintings were in the townhouse would be even more special. The unlit landing seemed foreboding, but a maid soon approached them at the landing, clasping a lantern. Margaret shrank back. They'd been discovered. Fiddle-faddle. Margaret shifted her legs, preparing herself for an icy stare and a firm word, the sort Margaret's classmates had received at their finishing school, but which had never been directed at her. Margaret obeyed rules, even the unwritten ones. She knew better than to wander upstairs, even if the Duke was not currently roaming the darkened corridors. This was when the maid would tell them to leave. Instead, the maid nodded at Mamma. This way. Margaret blinked. Had the maid witnessed the incident and ascended another staircase? But maids were generally not present at balls. Perhaps a footman had informed her? Margaret furrowed her brow. The maid strode briskly, marching past sideboards and oversized blue and white porcelain vases that looked lavish even in the poor light, and Mamma and Margaret hurried after her. Their feet sank into luxurious carpets that muffled their steps, but the odd silence didn't soothe Margaret's ever-fasting, beating heart. Beatific smile radiated on Mamma's lips, even though normally she might grumble that the maid's speedy gait was unnecessary. Finally, the maid halted before a door. This is it. Thank you. Mamma pressed something onto the maid's hands. I'm afraid I'll need your help. The maid nodded gravely. Of course, she's quite large. In the next moment, the maid clasped hold of Margaret's wrists and dragged her inside the room. What are you doing? Margaret blurted, struggling against the maid's sturdy clasp. Confusion coursed through Margaret. Maids weren't supposed to pull one into rooms. No one was supposed to do that. Mamma? Margaret pleaded. Fingers shoved Margaret, fingers that did not belong to the maid. Both the maid's hands were clasped about Margaret's wrists like makeshift handcuffs. The lavender scent, her mother favored, floated about Margaret in an unmistakable fashion. Mamma was forcing her into the room. Mamma wasn't even prone to giving hugs. Yet now she shoved Margaret's back. The bed's to the right, the maid said in a professional manner, as if she were explaining the room's layout to a new guest who'd entered the proper way, with an invitation. Please release me, Margaret said in her most authoritative tone. What on earth is happening? Ensuring your future peace and happiness, Mamma squealed. Isn't that wonderful? Margaret's heart plummeted. An idea occurred to her. An abominable, atrocious, and alarming idea. Whose room is this? Margaret's voice wobbled, struggling against a suddenly dry throat, as if she'd entered the Sahara and not an opulent room in rainy, damp England. The Duke of Jevington's, Mamma declared. Your future husband. Heavens! Margaret squeezed her eyes shut. Unfortunately, when she opened them, the world remained the same as before.